Well, hello and welcome to History. It's been a while since we've had a history assignment. Last week was a short week, and we didn't get a chance to do any history last week, but we're going to get right back to it this week. We are still kind of in the middle of the American Revolution. And as last you read card number 21, America Declares Independence. You read about the Declaration of Independence, and you answered some questions based on the card. And just to recap what the purpose of the Declaration of Independence was, there were three main purposes in the document. The first one was to express the beliefs of what a good government should look like. The second one was to outline exactly what King George III of England had done wrong in the eyes of the colonies. And the third thing that the Declaration of Independence did was it announced that the colonies were now free and independent states. So now we're going to move on to the next set of cards. The next card is Washington Commands the Continental Army. I want to do this a little bit differently. Rather than just having you read the card and answering the questions, I'm going to actually highlight some of the things that are on the back of the card and read it with you and go over some of this information that I have on my whiteboard here. So if you want to pause the video and you want to go ahead and get your cards and turn to Washington Commands the Continental Army, we're just going to briefly, like I said, read it and go over some of the basic facts. So go ahead and get your cards. And when you get them, you should notice that this is a painting of one of Washington's most famous accomplishments as leader of the Continental Army. This is a painting of what it might have looked like for George Washington to lead his troops across the icy Delaware River and later go on to defeat the German troops who were working for the British, known as the Hessians, and capture many of those and make a pretty significant victory in Trenton, New Jersey. Okay, let's read the back of the card. First of all, you'll notice that he commanded the Continental Army from the years 1775 to 1781. I have those years up on the board. In May 1775, the Continental Congress made George Washington commander-in-chief of all American armies. Washington won the first battles. Due to these early victories, Americans supported the war and men enlisted. America suffered defeats in 1777 to 1778 and fled to Valley Forge after Philadelphia, the colonial capital, fell to the British. In 1777, America won an important victory at Saratoga, formally bringing France in to back the colonies. So that was an important battle because now France recognized that the Americans had a chance of winning, and so they actually joined with the Americans to fight against the British. And having the support of the French was a huge help for the American army. In the French ship Bonhomme Richard, John Paul Jones met and defeated the British ship Serapis. Even though Jones's ship was badly damaged, he refused to give up, saying, "I have not yet begun to fight." So he was a famous colonial army hero, John Paul Jones, a naval hero. The British continued to fight mainly in the South, but were frustrated by guerrilla fighters. Remember the term guerrilla fighting that we learned in the French and Indian War, when people would hide behind rocks and trees and shrubs and fire upon the enemy. Well, guerrilla fighters like Francis Marion, known as the Swamp Fox, fought mainly in the South for the colonies. Finally, British commander Lord Cornwallis's army found themselves surrounded by French ships in the Chesapeake Bay and Washington's troops on land. He surrendered in October 1781. Okay, so the back of that card really sweeps wide between the years, really the beginning of the war all the way to the end of the war. So it's kind of like an overview of Washington's whole command of the Continental Army. I want to, again, look at a couple of things here on the board that would fall under this heading of Washington commanding the Continental Army. So if you remember, the First Continental Congress met in 1774. You might even remember the song that we sang with that. It was actually at the Second Continental Congress in May of 1775 that George Washington was actually chosen to be commander of the colonial or continental army. And it was a job that he didn't really want, which is, I find, really interesting. So the Second Continental Congress is really known specifically for doing three important memorable things. The first thing is that they named Washington General of the Continental Army. Now, I'm going to read just a little bit about this in From Colonies to Country. It's not necessary for you to have your book. You can just listen along. I'm going to read just a little bit about it. So there were other people that wanted the job of general commander of the whole army, including the patriot John Hancock, who you might know from Johnny Tremain as a character in Johnny Tremain, very wealthy John Hancock from Boston. But he didn't get the job. The majority wanted George Washington to be the commander. And it says here, at this Second Continental Congress, George Washington was elected unanimously. Everyone agreed. He accepted on one condition: he would take no salary. That means he didn't want to get paid for this job, which really says a lot about him and his character and his virtue. And that was part of Washington's greatness. He was willing to serve without pay for a cause that he thought was noble. Washington knew that the general's job could lead to disaster. England was the greatest power in the world. Its army was well trained and supplied with the latest guns and cannons, and its navy was the finest in the world. The American army was made up of a raggedy bunch of men, farmers, shoemakers, carpenters, blacksmiths, who had few guns, no cannons, and no military training. George Washington knew that he had an almost impossible job, and he said to Patrick Henry, now remember, Patrick Henry was the famous statesman who said, "Give me liberty or give me death." He said, "Remember, Mr. Henry, what I tell you now. From the day I enter upon the command of the American armies, I date my fall and the ruin of my reputation." So Washington is saying, okay, I'm going to take this on, but I predict that I'm going to fail and my reputation is going to be ruined because this is such a monumental task, commanding this ragtag army against one of the greatest armies in the world at that time, Britain's army. George Washington set out for Boston. Let me back up. And that too is part of what made Washington great. He was willing to do what he thought was right and important, even if it might bring his own ruin. And of course, we know it didn't bring ruin. It made him famous for all time. George Washington set out for Boston to take charge of the soldiers gathered there. In the meantime, the Continental Congress tried to patch things up with King George III of England. They sent another petition to King George. Remember, the First Continental Congress did this as well. And this one was called the Olive Branch Petition because an olive branch is a symbol for peace. And they wanted this was a letter asking the king to once again just consider their problems and petitions. And it might seem strange that the colony was, at the same time, the colonies were creating an army and appointing a general, but then they were also sending a letter to King George seeking peace. So there were still a lot of people that wanted peace between England and the colonies, didn't want a war. But King George III refused to read the Olive Branch Petition, wouldn't even read it. So, war was later declared. The last thing that the Second Continental Congress is known for is producing the Declaration of Independence. And I have here that it took a year, because you may remember that the Continental Congress met in 1775, May, and of course the Declaration of Independence was written by Thomas Jefferson. Benjamin Franklin and John Adams assisted, helping make some changes, but the Declaration of Independence was not officially signed and accepted until July of the following year. So these things are important that happened during the American Revolution, and that leads us up to what I'd like for you to do today. We're going to go ahead and move on to the winter at Valley Forge, which occurred during the winter of 1777 to 1778. So what I would like for you to do is I'd like for you to briefly read, just read the back of the card. You don't have to answer any specific questions. Just read over the back of the card. And then I want you to read a little bit further, because usually the back of the card is really just an overview. I want you to read a little bit more detail in your From Colonies to Country textbook. So once you've read the back of the card, flip on over to page 130 in From Colonies to Country, Valley Forge to Vincennes, and you're going to be reading about the conditions and what important things occurred in Valley Forge during the winter of 1777 to 1778. So as you know, Valley Forge is in Pennsylvania. It's not too far from us. It is a national park, historic site. So this summer, hopefully you can get out with your family. Maybe you can make that a family trip to Valley Forge. It's a very unique and interesting place to visit. And is so close by. But I'd like for you to read pages 130 just to page 132. You'll notice that at the bottom of page 132, that's kind of the end of the book's description about Valley Forge. It's not necessary for you to read on, because today we're just focusing on Valley Forge. Now, while you read, I'd like for you, and I've included these directions in RenWeb, but I'm going to just state them here just to probably make it easier. You need to have a piece of paper handy. I realize you don't have your history notebook. That's where we would have taken notes if we were together in class. You can just use a sheet of paper. I want you to focus on, and I've actually created a little whiteboard here. If you could take your sheet of paper and just kind of divide it in half, I want you to focus on looking for specific details as you read about Valley Forge. On the one side, I want you to jot down, and this would just be in bullet point form, what were some of the hardships or challenges that the soldiers and Washington, their leader, faced while they were encamped at Valley Forge. So during the winters, armies didn't normally fight during that time. So the Continental Army moved to Valley Forge, this area outside of Philadelphia, and set up camp for the winter. So it was important because a lot of things happened there. That's why we remember it. So what were some of the hardships and challenges that Washington and his men faced? Bullet points, you can just, I think I've indicated that you need to write at least 4. And then also, there were some major successes and accomplishments that came out of that time at Valley Forge. So bullet point, again, no complete sentences, but what were some of the successes and accomplishments of the Army during the winter of Valley Forge? I think I had said that you need to put at least 3. So if you can read pages 130 to 132 and just stop and make some bullet point notes like I've shown you here, when you're finished, hang on to these, because tomorrow I'm going to have you write a little paragraph using your notes here from this. So that's today's history assignment. You're going to read pages, well, first of all, you read the back of Winter at Valley Forge card. And then you will read pages 130 and From Colonies to Country to 132. And then you will be taking some brief notes on the hardships and struggles and successes and accomplishments at Valley Forge in 1777 to 1778. And that's your assignment.